kulkenuthan se on, mutta ei tarpeeksi kovaa.
Onko murheita?
Ei tässä mitään. Ei mitään erikoista.
Aleni menee kovaa.
Niin menee, joo. En mä tiedä, en mä oo tyytyväinen yhtään. Ei oo irtonut silleen fiilistä vielä.
Huomenna irrot.
No kyllä, jotain täytyy tehdä tai lähteä vaikka himaan täältä.
As with most sports, being at your best possible endurance and athleticism is key when it comes to preparing yourself for competition. This also rings true for motorsports. IndyCar drivers, and even those in NASCAR, need to be in shape to wield their respective machines. Mark Martin, in the case of NASCAR, was the first to do so, starting his training regimen in 1988, committed to a very strict diet and workout reps. The last thing on his mind was drinking or chain smoking. None of this, however, would ring true for former Group B rally champ Timo Salonen, perhaps the most unlikely champion in the sport's history, let alone that era in particular. How does such a pudgy figure, with more Marlboros in his system than even Jason Plato, make the grade? From Datsuns to Group B off-road supercars, this is the story of Timo Salonen. Timo was born on October 8th, 1951, in Helsinki, Finland. Given the nature of Finnish roads, Timo practically began racing as early as he was allowed to drive, and made him a natural fit for the fast undulations of rally racing. His first race came in 1970, not long after graduating high school, in a Datsun 1600, or, for those in the US, the much-beloved Datsun 510. He wasn't bankrolling this from some sponsor money either. Instead, he opted to pay all this out of pocket, via bank loans. He continued participating in local rally events throughout the early 1970s, taking part in events such as his local Helsinki rally, driving both an Isuzu and a Mazda 1300. In 1974, Timo would make the jump to the European Rally Championship, albeit on a limited schedule, opting to mostly run in local Finnish events. Despite this, he would also find time to squeeze in one WRC event, making his first World Rally debut at the Thousand Lakes Rally. He'd finished 22nd that day, just ahead of Sweden's Nilsson Boye, in a Volvo 142. It was also this year when he'd make the join-up with his new co-driver and best friend, Seppo Harniene. Though he'd been around in a limited ERC capacity before, this was also his first WRC start. They'd go on to be a very successful team there, as well as Marlboro smoking pals. 1975 would show the pace of the Fat Finn. He would see an early end to his attempts at the Marlboro Arctic Rally, but he'd finish a very respectable 6th at the Thousand Lakes Rally. This was particularly impressive given his rather relaxed driving style. He would only be 4 seconds off the pace from Per Eklund, the legendary Swedish speedy ace. It was also around this time where the nickname of Loisa, meaning slack, was starting to endearingly be coined for him. To onlookers, especially rally regulars, a thick-framed man with thick-framed glasses, with more beer in his belly than actual sandwiches, and more tobacco smoke in his lungs than actual oxygen, would leave May to assume that he would only be there to putt around the track for fun. But he very much was there to compete, and he would still chuck it into turns, and still make snappy shifts through the gears. He might have looked like a slouch outside the car, but make no mistake, he sure didn't drive like one. It was also around this time where he got his first factory drive, this time for Datsun proper in a 160J. It would be in 1976 where he would nab his first ever rally win at the Solara Rally. A local rally win, yes, but this was a prelude for what was about to come. Despite early retirements from at least 3 events that year, he wouldn't finish worse than 6th on most of the schedule. 1977 would prove to be even bigger still, where he would land a few podium finishes, a top 5, and his first ever WRC win at the Canadian Rally in Quebec in a Fiat 131. 1978, 79, and 1980 would all put him on the receiving end of the hard knocks of the rally schedule. Suspension failures, exploded differentials, blown motors, and ending up in a ditch before finding the finish line would all end rather impressive runs for him at most stages. Highlights, however, would prove that he could still make it out, with podium finishes at Rally Quebec, the Lombard RAC, and at the Thousand Lakes. Things would turn around in 1981, however, with a hard-fought finish at the incredibly difficult Safari Rally, earning him a 4th place spot, which would be quickly followed up with another 4th place finish at the Thousand Lakes that year. Another WRC win would come at the Ivory Coast in a Datsun Violet GT. He would be en route for yet another WRC win at the Lombard RAC, but slower speeds on later stages and ultimately an engine failure put him out of contention altogether. Another win would come at the European Rally Championships return of the Arctic Rally, with 2 WRC top 5 finishes at Rally New Zealand and the Thousand Lakes, respectively. 1983 would lead up to be the biggest shakeup in his career. It was the second year of Group B. Group B, a name that doesn't need much introduction. The mental era of potent powerhouses that were more or less Formula 1 cars with mud flaps. It also brought about the introduction of four-wheel drive and turbocharged revolution. The message that Audi and its Quattro were sending was very straightforward to the competing manufacturers. Well, to all except Nissan, apparently. Lancia at least tried, opting for a lightweight, nimble, mid-engine supercharged four-banger that looked as good as it ran. Even Renault, makers of the Renault 5, created a diminutive mid-engine menace that had been competing as early as 1980. Whilst Nissan's introduction wasn't exactly heavy, the 240 RS was still rather rudimentary. Rear-wheel drive, naturally aspirated, and didn't even use electronic fuel injection, let alone a power adder like a supercharger or a turbocharger. Its closest analog at the time would perhaps be the Opel Manta, or the Opel Ascona, similar in configuration, though would prove to be much more successful by comparison. Our big boy Timo, meanwhile, would have to tough it out and pilot the 240 RS for his Group B effort for the time being. Unfortunately, and perhaps somewhat unsurprisingly, things wouldn't go quite as well as planned. The steel-bodied Nissan would finish no better than 14th at Monte Carlo, and a bevy of gearbox and engine issues and a crash would derail any forward momentum they might have had. His only highlights, despite all the calamities, would be a second at New Zealand, and a respectable 10th at the Thousand Lakes. 1984 would show a rather promising underdog effort. Teething issues with the new car seemed to be mostly ironed out, with him finishing no worse than 10th that year at Monte Carlo, a 7th at the Safari Rally, 6th at the Acropoli, 4th at New Zealand, and even a 6th at the RAC. As a whole, however, despite the accomplishments with the iffy car, Timo felt that he had, quote, stayed around too long with the Japanese manufacturer, but felt, however, that it was beneficial to come into grips with the full WRC schedule, including all its ups and its downs. He also wanted to show that his metal was good enough against the likes of the world's best, proving that he wasn't so loisa as his onlookers might have thought. One of those onlookers of keen interest was Jean Todt. Nobody in particular, just the head of a, certain sport division, future F1 Ferrari general manager, and later the CEO of that, and later the head of the FIA. Just some bloke, nobody particularly special or noteworthy of interest. In the background, meanwhile, Peugeot was up to quite a lot. They were in a three-way heat in the hot hatch market, competing directly with the Ford Escort XR2 and the much-beloved Volkswagen Golf GTI. Ford would show a potential interest in joining into Group B by developing the Ford RS-1700T project that they eventually pulled the plug on, and as such Ford wouldn't show its round face until much later in the sport. In the meanwhile, Peugeot wasn't just content with leading in the hot hatch market, but also leading the whole World Rally Championship. The project was initially put pen to paper in around as early as 1981, with test fits of engines and mechanical components beginning in 1982. The development virtually had no budget ceiling. They'd happily keep signing off on blank checks and hope to develop the greatest rally machine that the world had ever seen, aiming straight at the Audi Quattro. The original aim was to have it go from drawing board to gravel road by about 1983, but additional attention and testing was required for it to meet the demands of punishing rally racing. Moreover, they only had test models in their stable. No actual cars had been produced, let alone 200 of them. However, those 200 cars would eventually arrive, and Peugeot's 205 T16 would officially pass homologation in April 1984. It shared absolutely nothing in common with the 205 hot hatch it was based on, aside from the A-pillars maybe. It was wider. The engine no longer sat in the front, but in the middle. It was no longer front-wheel drive either. Instead, the over 1700cc 4-cylinder turbocharged engine would power all 4 wheels. And it would even be enough to propel the 980 kilo frame from 0 to 60 in 3.5 seconds. What a machine. Peugeot had spared no expense in its creation, and they knew they had a real weapon on their hands. Eat your heart out, Exocet. Now, these are all rather impressive stats, there could be no doubt about that, along with incredible potential, certainly enough to perk up Audi's ears. But a great machine is only as great as its driver. Jean was a firm believer in an old motorsports adage, if you want to win, you get a fin. Ari Vatanen would be the first to lead in the 205, but his next phone call would be for our man Timo. Their styles would complement each other rather nicely on paper, and would actually prove to be the case in practice as well. What couldn't be charted on paper was just what types of surprises Timo was plotting behind those thick-rimmed glasses of his. Ari would show the serious potency of the 205 right out of the gate, and begun putting it through its paces, running through the gears perhaps a little bit too overzealously. An accident would kill his Tour de Corps run, and engine failure would dash his hopes at nabbing an Acropoli rally win. But he managed the unthinkable, and won 5 races in a row: the Thousand Lakes, San Remo, the Lombard RAC, Monte Carlo, and Rally Sweden. Timo, however, wouldn't be far behind, sharing the podium with Ari, and even getting a few wins where Ari could not, such as the Portugal Rally in 1985. The immense consistency of Timo's effort kept Peugeot in very firm contention. The Germans, meanwhile, could only look on with ire and anger, stomping their marching boots. This was a direct attack. The massive might of German engineering consortiums was now directly threatened by the French coffee shop tourists. It was looking like Ari would have a direct, open road paved for him for an easy championship. Rally Argentina, however, would have had other ideas.
And Ari's fight back here on the Monte Carlo remained the season's highlight so far. All the despondency felt after co-driver Terry Harriman's mistake dispelled with a quite exhilarating display of flat-out driving. All the more horrifying then when Ari himself was a victim of a violent accident in Argentina, the car cartwheeling at around 120 miles an hour. Terry Harriman was able to lift himself from the wreckage, but Vatanen was gravely injured with a crushed chest, broken leg and fractured vertebrae. His chances of survival looked remote.
This would leave Ari Vatanen with life-threatening injuries, and he would have to endure 18 months in hospital. Timo, meanwhile, didn't have a lot of time to worry about his state of affairs, and was seemingly content with just putting around one-handed around most stages. This changed everything, though. It was no longer time to be conservative. The season was rapidly approaching its end, and now it was put up or shut up for the Peugeot effort. And put up he did. Along with his Portuguese rally win, at Rally Acropoli, even electrical faults would stop him from winning it. Followed with yet another win at New Zealand, Argentina, the Thousand Lakes, and the Lombard RAC. If you thought 5 wins in a row was impressive, try 6. This was a record that would remain unbroken until 2005. He'd be crowned the 1985 WRC champion, and thus, the least likely champ would stand upon the podium as number 1. And the world had to simply cope with the fact that this is, in fact, what peak performance looks like. He would return to Peugeot a year later, and still would put on one hell of a performance, getting 2 wins, a runner-up, and a 5th place finish that year. Whilst he wouldn't get back-to-back championships, he'd still finish 3rd overall, and become the winningest driver of the Group B era in doing so. Timo would continue his rallying career with Mazda, starting in 1987, managing to actually win a rally race with the Japanese manufacturer that year at Rally Sweden. Turbo and general engine maladies would prevent him from trying to go for any other wins, however. The new rallying era, now called Group A, produced much more tame and slower cars by comparison to the mental machines of just a year prior. Despite this, he would fail to win another race, only managing some runner-up finishes and podium placements. After this, he would begin to end his full-time competition in 1992, with his last drive being with Mitsubishi. Aside from that, and some part-time starts in 2002 and 2003, he would never finish better than 14th. So, what is the biggest champion in rally history up to now? Well, a much more tame life for him for a start, sharing stories of old and running a small car dealership, branded after his namesake, Timo Salonen. He still observes the sport, though not through a car windshield and instead through his TV. It's likely that we may see him do more special event starts, just as he did even as late as 2019, but that currently remains to be seen. In the meantime, however, here's to you, Timo. You were, and forever will be, the people's champion.